Good morning. We are in Ayin Beis, volume 3. And we finished the page 1271, but we went back much earlier to review the beginning of this whole subject matter, Gan Eden, the role of Gan Eden, its function, and we've come away with an understanding that Gan Eden represents a central component, I should say, of the whole creation of existence and its purpose. Namely, the Gan Eden is created by God as a special, unique place in Seder Hishtalshelus, in the cosmic order. And when we do our work in this world, Gan Eden is the place that stores, essentially, the energy generated by our avodah, by our work. So in addition to Gan Eden being unique in its own right, Havaya Lakim, like we said, the avodah of a person increases, it calls it tasteless air, additional and intensified and greater energies in Gan Eden. Olam Haba, we touched upon, and we'll get back to much later, is the future. Gan Eden is just neshamas, but it's a result of the avodah that we do. And we've also learned that there's two parts to this work. There's the actual maisa mitzvahs, the kavanah, the intention is to actually do an action in this world, which is mitzvahs that are actionable, not just spiritual, as it was before Matan Torah by the Ovis and Adam Arishan. And then there's the kavanah of the mitzvahs. And we learned about two different kavanahs. A general Kabbalah Shel Malchus Shamayim, that we're accepting God's mitzvahs, we are fulfilling what God wants, and then a more specific and more detailed and more in-depth intention. And that is where Gan Eden comes into play, because the Maisa alone is critical, because without that, you don't have anything to trigger. But Gan Eden stores spiritual energy, whether it's Gan Eden Atachten, the Kavanah of Kabbalah Shel, or Gan Eden Elyon, the Kavanah Pnimius, we call it the Seid HaPnimi, and the inner details of each particular mitzvah. Okay. But then we were also left with several questions, which are still hanging, and many of them will be answered later, but now that we're learning. So I reviewed so far 12:11, 12:12, 12:13. Then I skipped the 5 pages, and though now we've made reference to them, so we understand Keser and Malchus, in order to understand the role of Gan Eden. And then we returned to page 1218, which I reviewed yesterday, 1218, 1219, and now we're in the middle of 1220. So I want to finish reviewing this last page, then the context of how that flows into the next section, and then go back to where we're up to. Or at least maybe I'll go back not just where we're up to, but also go back to Gan Eden on the other end of this conversation, which is pages later. So what we reviewed yesterday was a little more detail about how Gan Eden gets illuminated. That's why mitzvahs are called flames, candles, like neshama called candles, because a candle illuminates. So therefore, when we do a mitzvah, it illuminates. And what does it illuminate? Me'im esa Gan Eden. They illuminate Gan Eden. So Gan Eden is the garden. Our work illuminates it and makes it grow and makes it develop even further, as we learn. But it's all within Mamala Kolam, and I should emphasize, which means it's all within the paradigm of Seder Hishtalshelus. It's just that it's more abundant. This has not entered into the realm of Sevav Kolam or higher. That's where the Maisa mitzvahs, the actual mitzvahs, reach that. But this reaches Giluyim. Like I spoke about, it's not just about you having a core connection to God, but it should also be, you should be a godly person. Your behavior, your actions, your thought, speech, and actions, your mind and your heart, and your whole being is permeated with godliness. Not just your etzem and neshama is doing what God wants. And that's where Gan Eden Mamala Kalaman, which is why the whole Seder Hishtalshelus exists in the first place, is because we want it also revealed, we want it integrated. Not just a core connection from the highest to the lowest, but have the whole being. In other words, sometimes it says, for instance, that the mere fact that you do a mitzvah, you go have a rotzlet dvar mitzvah, you run to do a mitzvah, the legs are fulfilling what God wants. But God doesn't just want the legs and the arms. That's the ultimate purpose. But he wants also your mind and your heart and your whole being, all your faculties should also be divine. And that's where the kavanah, the intention, goes. And that's why he explained that Gan Eden is hasaga. The neshamas in Gan Eden, they understand godliness. And through understanding, they come to have pleasure. He said the words, Tainug shemisangim al kus, and the Tainug, which is Keser Malchus, that Tainug is Mechinas Keser, but the way it manifests in Bina. So it's a pleasure that's coming as it manifests in our deep appreciation. The example I used, there's not just we know there's an artist, the mitzias of godliness, but we know the mahus, the personality of the artist. And in that we take pleasure. That's what Gan Eden is. That's why he said that the rest of the worlds, they receive the energy from the lower 7 levels of Malchus. Gan Eden receives from the 3 higher levels, Keser, Chachma, Bina, but it's all as it shines through Bina, which is a full comprehension. Okay. So the rest of the world really connect to God as a creator. He wants to have a house. He wants to have art. But Gan Eden, you understand the deeper kavanah of the intention of the artist in it, and thereby also understanding God to some extent on a deeper level. Okay, Keser. Yeah. Now, on top of page 1220, the last thing we learned was that this idea of Gan Eden is central to creation, that the Medrash says that from the beginning of the world, God was not busy. He wasn't busy with anything except plantings. And it brings the proof, the planting of the garden in Gan Eden. Why? Because that plays a central role. Because the human being who's the central player, the key player in existence to fulfill God's desire, God's plan and objective and mission, is compared to a tree in the field. And that's rooted in the tree in the field of Zav Atzilus, is a tree in the field. And that is rooted, the tree is Zah, but it also has a root in Ayin Keser, like we said, because that's where the pleasure is. And it's root, and Gan Eden is rooted in Eden. The garden is planted in Eden, so this Zah is planted in Eden. Eden is Chachma. Bina is the river that flows out of Eden and irrigates the garden, as we've been discussing. And then there's an Eden, a higher Eden, that is a level of Keser. So it begins with Keser, goes to Chachma, and through the river travels in Bina, and there you have the garden. Now, even though we learned the garden is in Bria, but remember, it's rooted, as he said, in Atzilus. It's rooted in Atzilus. Now, this, mind you, is still all Gan Eden on its own, not through Avodah. He's talking about what happens in Gan Eden. We're going to soon. So we know now that the 3 higher levels of the spheres, Keser, Chacham, Bina of Malchus, like he said, or Bina specifically, is Gan Eden, but he said clearly that's Gan Eden on its own. We're soon going to learn what happens when we, through Avodah, which is really going to be the next 50 pages. The Avodah that makes Gan Eden grow. But let's continue the summary. So I'm now looking at page 1220. And the line that begins, Gan Eden Elyon de Bria. Yeah. So it all originates in Keser, Chachma to Bina. From there goes into Malchus and into Gan Eden in Bria. So when we say that Gan Eden is in Bria, and then we just said that Gan Eden is rooted in Atzilus, is because that's the root of it. But Gan Eden, its actual location is in Bria. But the 3 higher levels of that come from the 3 higher levels of Malchus, and thus rooted all the way to the highest levels of Keser, Chachma, and Bina in Atzilus. Okay. So now, Omnom, the Rebbe Rashab continues. When it says Vayita Hashem Elokim, it says Lashon Netiyah, that he planted the garden in Eden. She says, even even though the pleasure in Gan Eden comes originally from the pleasure that's manifest in Chachma, so now he's going to explain that even though it originates from there, but there's also a somewhat of a distance between them. The distance is that the pleasure as it's experienced in Gan Eden, in Bria, is not the same as it is in Chachma. And he compares it to the physical. When we talk about when you plant a garden, he says, the Natiya, when you plant seeds in the garden, so we know that everything grows because there's a mazel. It says, Ein lecha esav lamata, there's no blade of grass below that does not have a mazel lamaila, meaning a divine so-called emissary, divine energy that says, that strikes it and says grow. So everything in physical has a mazel, but the physical growth of something compared to its mazel is quite distant. This is physical and that's spiritual. So he's going to compare that to how things grow in Gan Eden and Bria compared to the way the pleasure is in Chachma. So he says like this. Here it says clear, so he gives an example. A physical apple has sweetness, and on the palate, when you taste it, you taste sweetness. But when you say the root of where that apple came from, does it also have sweetness? Physical sweetness? No. So both the power of growth in the earth that allows this tree to grow, this apple tree to grow, does not have physical taste. So how does one evolve from the next? So he says the mesikus, the sweetness comes from chesed, and bitterness comes from gvura. So the root is in chesed and gvura, but chesed, it doesn't have anything in common with physical sweetness. The only thing is chesed is also sweet, but it's spiritually sweet. So what happens? It evolves from a spiritual archetype called chesed. As it evolves and begins to assume garments, physical garments, it will end up becoming a sweet apple. That's what he wants to emphasize here. Why does he want to emphasize it? We'll see in a moment. So even though they're distant because one is physical, one is spiritual, but you can't say they're completely apart because they have something in common. They're both sweet. It's like when you say, he's going to say an example. Like we see there's different types of sweetness. There's the sweetness of wisdom. It's called sweet. There's the sweetness when you do chesed. It also is sweetness when you're sweet to somebody. And then there's sweetness that you put in a sweet apple in your mouth and you taste sweetness. So on one hand, those levels of sweetness have nothing in common because they're different types of sweetness, but they all are called sweet. So there's something in common and something not in common among them. Okay. He also gives the example of the sweetness of a song, Tainuk Shel Nigun, which is the outer expression of midas. So seichel, emotion, kindness, and a nigun. Now, from all of this will evolve, ultimately, he says, Mesikus Gashmi, even though they remain very far apart. Now, this is key to the whole interface that we learn in Ayin Beis in general, that on one hand, there's something similar, on the other hand, there's something apart. So when we study and experience physical sweetness, as I explained, when you start teaching a child Aleph Beis, the custom is you smear honey and sugar on a page of the cover page of Tanya or a page of Aleph Beis. Because for a child, they relate to physical sweetness. As they get older, they'll understand that the physical sweetness was really like a mushal, a garment to help us appreciate spiritual sweetness. So really the process of growth is a Gan Eden compared to Chachma of Atzilus is like that. It's the sweetness of the pleasure that you have in understanding God, but compared to the way it's not Atzilus, it's like the difference between physical and spiritual, even though Gan Eden is not physical, but relatively speaking. That's what he's leading up to here. V'chein I'll read it inside. V'chein hu be'inyan began Eden, hagam sha'atainug hanimsha began Eden b'chinas ha'chachma. Even though the pleasure originates in chachma v'atzilus, afal became ein arech b'neim. Nevertheless, there's an infinite distance between them. It's like the blade of grass, the grass compared to its mazel, its spiritual root. Then he added, I'll just go over it just to refresh our memories, that Esav is also the letters Ayin Beis Shin. Esav is 3 letters, Ayin Shin Beis, but it's Ayin Beis Shin, which refers to Lamshach of Das, and that's the idea of Hasogel Lekisha B'Gan Eden. So grass, the spiritual grass of Gan Eden, is a knowledge and a comprehension of godliness, as we said, that brings pleasure. But compared to Chochmah, it's like the grass compared to its root, to its spiritual root. Yeah. So there's still an infinite distance. The action is Gashem Acha Nasa Tainish. So now the souls of Bria Tzirasir can have some taste of this divine pleasure, and that's higher than the worlds on their own, where they only know of the existence of the Creator, but not his inner personality. And even though Gan Eden is not mamish a creation like the rest of the world, like we see in sweetness, even though they're different, they still have that commonality. You can't call it yesh ma'ayin, because the spiritual sweetness has something in common with physical sweetness. And sweetness in general is like he said. So even though it's not the same person, it's not the same substance. This is physical, this is spiritual, but it's from the same personality. It's the same, they're both sweet. It's not sweet and bitter. It's sweet and sweet, just more sublime levels of sweetness. Right? Okay. So this last piece simply put into context that though Gan Eden, on one hand, is higher than the worlds, and we're getting some of the mohus, and not just the mitzias, the personality of godliness, and not its mitzias, it's still a far cry from the way godliness is experienced in Atzilus and higher. And this is going to be relevant because Gan Eden, after all, is still Mamal Kalalman, and is still in the Seder Shtalshlus. Even Gan Eden. So therefore, Gan Eden has its limitations, especially now. He's talking before Avodah. He's talking Gan Eden on its own. So Gan Eden on its own is an elevated state of consciousness, but it still has a certain distance from the root of that consciousness in Atzilus. Now he's going to go back and say, what about Avodah? What does Avodah accomplish? Avodah is going to take Gan Eden to another the realm. So he says, I'm reading now the bottom. This is going to lead us into the next section, as you'll see in a moment. This is critical. The next few lines, the bottom of page 1220 and the top of page 1221 are really, really critical in understanding the whole flow afterwards. We couldn't have understood it when we learned it the first time, but now we will. So listen to this. I'm going to read it inside. However, through the Aved of Torah Mitzvos in this world, we draw and we generate additional, increased energies in Gan Eden. And anything that's additional by God is even more than the original principle, so to speak. In other words, the interest, the accumulated and exponential growth that comes to Avodah ultimately creates more. So it's not like Gan Eden has, let's say, 90%, and your Avodah adds another 10%. But the Avodah adds outweighs and overshadows that which Gan Eden has on its own. That means Meruba La'ikr. So if you invested $10 and you made $20, that's not Meruba La'ikr. If you invested 10 and you made $100, that's Meruba La'ikr. So what happened was that your Avodah generated much more than what was there in the first place. And what does that entail? This is the primary receiving of reward of the souls in Gan Eden. As we explained, reward here is not like a candy or a toy or incidental. Reward is a direct result. When you do a mitzvah and you learn, and with a mitzvah with kavanah in this world, that itself creates the energy of godliness. And therefore, Gan Eden there is simply a reflection and a result, cause and effect of the Avodah. That in Gan Eden, the neshamas are benefiting from the reflection of the divine that came as a result of their Torah and the Avodah. So in this world, we're going to learn later whether there is a reward or no reward, or some reward. But in Gan Eden, for sure, what the neshama did, all its exertion and efforts in Avodah, when it comes to Gan Eden, it now has essentially, I don't want to call it a retirement account, but whatever you did is now ready for you. So now you can benefit from the Avodah, and that is what Gan Eden is through Avodah. So now he's going to explain what exactly takes place. And this is now the key lines that transition from this, that will go now into the whole, literally, we're talking about almost 50 pages of discussing the levels of Avodah that help us grow. And in turn, that is what Gan Eden becomes expanded through that Avodah. So this is what he says. Yeah, and I've marked down. Actually, he'll return now to the Gan Eden. This is 1220 on 1254. So 34 pages from here, he's going to return to Gan Eden. And then we're already 50 pages and 1271. And he's going to continue the discussion, as I'll soon review as we finish this section here. So what's the inyan? The inyan is that we have established there's Gan Eden, there's the world, there's Gan Eden on its own, there's now Gan Eden through Avodah. So he explains, what does Avodah add? The kamoishi yesh primis v'chetzenis b'pchinas hamalchus. Just like there's an inner and outer dimension of malchus, v'hainu kanal, like we learned before. Chetzenis hamalchus is the world. Primis hamalchus, the three higher levels in malchus, is Gan Eden on its own. V'hainu kanal, v'hefresh bein ha'elamis l'Gan Eden. What do we learn the difference between the worlds and Gan Eden? The be'elamis subchinas zayin tachtein is the malchus. In the world, you have the 7 lower levels of malchus, which only experiences the mitzias of godliness, the existence, but not the mahus. This is in general the outer. In Gan Eden, we have the 3 higher, the keser chachma bina, the pleasure, the resonance of chachma, and the understanding of bina. This is a deeper dimension where you're seeing a reflection of the face of the creator or the face of the teacher, not just an external expression. So just like in Malchus, you have inner and outer. That's the difference between outer and inner, the worlds and Gan Eden. So on top of page 1221, I continue. So too in Zah. Remember, Zah is the place where things grow. Zah is Eitz HaSoda, the tree in the field. Zah is the midas that develop. So there's also pinimis and chetzenis. There's a pinimis of ubchinis. Pinimis the Zah. Ubchinis gili hamoichim bezah. What's the pinimis of Zah? Just like in Malchus, the pinimis is keser chachma bina. So in Zah too, the midas. What's the pinimis? The revelation of moichin of Zah, the gimel reshenis of Zah. Just like there's gimel reshenis in Malchus, there's gimel reshenis in Zah. Keser chachma bina of midas. The Zayin Tachtein is the Zah, and the lower section, and the 7 lower levels of Zah, and the 7 lower levels of Zah, when they don't have the revelation of intelligence, that's the level of Chitzenis. I'll explain this in a minute. Well, let me explain it right now. So what he's introducing now is this. Everything is obviously relative, but I'm going to go back to the example of the teacher and the artist. When you're that Talmud Muvik, a very special student that really knows your teacher well, or you know the artist well, you're not just, his product. You don't just know the art and that there exists an artist or a teacher, but you've gotten to know the teacher. What are you getting to know? His inner personality, which is his moichin, his keser chachma bina. The student that just knows the teacher's ideas is only receiving the flow that is commensurate to the student. That's called Zayin Tachtenis, both in Malchus on a lower level, and now in Zah, when you go higher, it's also the same. When you experience and have a relationship with someone emotionally, you can have a relationship that's also I don't want to say superficial, but on a more surface level. And then you can have a relationship that you just, not only are you emotionally connecting, but you also connect to the deeper part of the emotions that relates to the Gimel Rishenis, like the deeper emotions that people who really know each other well have that connection. That's just 2 different ways of connecting. So what he's saying here is just like you have in Malchus, the 2 levels, which is the difference between the worlds and Gan Eden, also Zah, which is now the next level. Remember, Malchus, at the end of the day, relatively speaking to Zah, is still action-based. It's still more external. But in the external itself, there's the inner of the external and the external of the external. Midas means you're getting to know the person's emotions. Malchus is more the person's behavior. So now, when it comes to emotions, he's saying there's also 2 levels. And this is the transition, the bridge to the entire discussion that's now going to last for over 30 pages, where he's going to talk about the growth of the emotions. Why? Because a child, let's talk about a child and a parent. A child's relationship with a parent is very malchusdik. It's very external. What does that mean? Obviously, they love each other, but the child doesn't appreciate the parent in any profound way. The child knows it's getting its needs met. I'm talking the child to the parent, not the parent to the child. And the child is basically on a very behavioral level. Its relationship with its parents. As the child grows and becomes more aware, both the emotions and the cognitive powers of the child grow, the relationship becomes deeper. The same is true student and teacher. A student that's just a beginner is learning Ayin Beis from a teacher. It's more Malchus level. But then you begin to get to know the emotions of your teacher. And as you grow, you get to know deeper emotions until you start understanding the mind of your teacher. So what he's going to explain now is that same thing is with Gan Eden. When we are doing our avodah in this world, what we're doing is we're growing, we're maturing. You can have a very basic, almost childish relationship with God, which is behavioral. God said, do mitzvahs, you do mitzvahs. Or you can learn Torah, and you could do things with intention and kavanah. Or even deeper, you learn Chassidus and Pnimius HaTorah. And you actually grow in appreciating God, not just that you're doing what God wants. So what's going to come now is going to be a whole discussion of all these levels. What are they going to be called ultimately? Behavioral, emotional, and cognitive. Mutva, murgish, muskul, or ibur, yanika, meichin. And that's where this now begins the discussion. So the next 30 pages is all going to be how we develop ourselves and how we grow in our Avodah, and in direct proportion to that is going to be our share in Gan Eden. Because remember, Gan Eden is just a cause and effect. All it is a result of our work. As I mentioned, Gan Eden is a place where only if you've earned your way you can enter. It's like going into an academy of scholars. If you haven't learned, you can sit there, but you won't appreciate anything. And remember, we're not talking about the power of Maisa HaMitzvos. Maisa propels you on a different level to the etzem. We're talking about giluyim, how you develop, how you grow. So as a child, if you remain a child in your Aveda, your Gan Eden will look like that. It will be a childish Gan Eden, basically. Or, as he said, if you don't have any kavanah, you won't have Gan Eden altogether. But the more you develop as a person, the more you appreciate. It would be like someone saying, I want to connect with the Rebbe in a very profound way. So it doesn't happen by magic. The more you learn his Torah, the more you connect to his instructions, the more you appreciate him. So therefore, you by effect, and as a result of your work, you appreciate the thing you're working toward. So this is what the next whole section is going to be about. How our Avodah creates the energy and generates the energy that will in turn lead us into higher and higher levels of spiritual consciousness, which essentially is Gan Eden. So I'm not going to go over now all these 30 pages because that we've done. Briefly, we know that it begins, like, I'll just read the beginning of it right here. Okay, what's going on here? Okay, so if you read the top of page 1221, he says, okay, so there's in this level of Zah, there's several levels. In Midas themselves, there's three levels. Chabad, Chagas, Nihi. Just as the body divides between Reish, Guf, Regel, there's a head, there's a body, and there are legs. So too, and a human being is primarily an emotional creature, Midas, and that's the Chabad, Chagas, Nihi. Now, why is a human being primarily emotional, even though we have a mind, and that makes us unique? Because the bottom line is life plays itself out at an emotional level in relationships. The mind is a tool, an instrument, but we're not walking computers. We're emotional creatures that have a mind that we can learn and grow and become cognitive and moich shal talev, self-control, and so on, as he continues teaching. And then he goes and says, Nihi is just the midas as they are, basically on a behavioral level, without any deeper feelings. I'm not going to go again through the whole thing. And then he goes on and says, Chagas is the gufa midas, is actually the emotions a person has, not just that they're acting. Like you could go and say, okay, I'm going to be kind to someone, but it's not because you feel kindness within your heart. You know that that's what you're supposed to do. Then he says, Mishu ish teva chesed be'etzem, his personality is kindness, and that's why he's kind like Avram Avinu. And Chabad is that it also has gili hamoichet. It's not just emotions, also the mind. You're doing it with a reason, with a deliberate intention, because your mind tells you that it's important to do chesed. And that causes even a bigger flow of chesed. That's what he says here. And then he goes, Uba'aveda, the next step is Uba'aveda b'chinas nihi hu haheskem. He starts speaking on Aveda. First, there's the determination. You just make a determination. I'm going to a determination, what we say, a resolution. I'm going to do what God wants. And then he brings the chapter 16 of Tanya that also can lead to not a feeling, but you sense that you should have a feeling of love. This is only he. Then comes Chagas in the Midas itself, and that is that you actually feel Midas. And then there's Moichin, where your mind, your cognitive mind, as he says, I'm looking now on page 1222, that with his bonanus, when a person contemplates, then it comes from then it creates even more emotions, as we've learned, emotions that are born from our contemplation. And then on the paragraph, the second paragraph on page 1222, he says, these three levels on a higher level, speaking on a higher level, on a higher approach, are mudve, murgish, and muskel. And this leads us into the whole growth and development of emotions as they move from behavioral to emotional, to emotional, to cognitive emotional, to the cognitive that gives birth to emotional, to the cognitive on its own. Panemius bina, gadlus ima, which is the growth of bina, and then the growth of chachma, which actually has the power to change emotions, and all the way till b'chol moedecha on its higher interpretation, that it's not just filling your being, but it's leading you to a place of intense mesiras nefesh and love that completely all-consuming, and that also affects the mind, and the emotions are not just being harnessed or taken care of by the mother that hovers over them. The mother that hovers and protects her young, but the midas have now grown and matured to the point that they catapult bina back to chachma, pnimius of chachma and bina, yichud abba v'ima, the zivug shlim, where they both gaze at arich and atik, and in this all-consuming love, you're connected to the divine on a far, far higher level. That's the summation of everything that will go now, these 30-some pages. And now I want to take you back. Let's go back to the end of that, because I'm not going to go over that right now. That would be really going over the whole, even though it's worthy doing. But I'm just summing up what the point of it is. And that takes us back. Now we're going back to page 1254. Aleph Reish Nun Daled. So after this long discussion of all these levels of growth, remember, all these levels of growth is the work that we do that is going to ultimately make Gan Eden into a far higher reality, because Gan Eden is no longer just what it is on its natural level, it's what Avodah accomplishes. That what we illuminate with the neirus of mitzvos and all our Avodah. So as we grow in our emotional maturity and cognitive growth, that will create a far higher level in Gan Eden. And then where does he say that? So he comes back to it on page 1254. So after talking about all these levels, which also included, I should say, Biti, Achesi, and Imi, the three levels of the growth. Biti as Malchus receives from Zah. Achesi as Malchus is equal to Zah. And Imi as Malchus is Mashpia in Zah. The Neshamas are now being Mashpia in Zah. Zah is Midas. So there's the place where Midas are informing Malchus. There's where Malchus comes equal to the Midas, like the Tanoim Amoraim that develop halacha. And then there was the Neshamas that Mashpia into Malchus, into Zah. And that is the highest level, Bina. And that comes from far higher levels, as we discussed. So now he goes back, Valpi Kol Hanal. According to all the above, Yuvan Hafresh ben Gan Eden mitzadatz ben Hamshachim ben Gan Eden shemamshichim teisves era idei aveda. He's literally taking us back to the page 1221 at the bottom. Now page 1254. Then now we'll understand what happens in Gan Eden that aveda adds over Gan Eden on its own, and there you see the flow. Now the Rebbe Rashab, when he was writing all this, he had it all in mind. When we were learning it, we went off, so to speak, into a whole new subject. But now when you go back and you see how all this is a result of the full explanation of our growth. So what does he say in this paragraph? Let me just read. I'm reading now the second paragraph on page 1254. He says like this. What is the difference? That's what we learned back then. Remember, the Gili of Gan Eden is Bina. As opposed, the worlds themselves is what he said was the level of Malchus as it receives from the Zayin Tachtenis. Gan Eden receives from Bina, which includes Keser and Chochmah. And now we understand what that means. Because when you develop your emotions to the point that they lift you back to Bina, and Bina stands side by side with Chochmah, and it gazes at what? At Keser, at Arich and Atik. That's the Avodah. Our maturation and growth and development of our emotions and cognitive lead us to a place that Bina, that Gan Eden is Bina, Shazain b'Yud Nivra Elam Haba, Bechinas Chochmah, and Elam Haba's Bina. Olam Haba here is an interpretation of Gan Eden. So he goes back here. It says Gil Gan Shazel Gili Gan Eden L'maylam in the Elamis, because in the Elamis you have Zayin Tachtenis Belvad. Okay, I just want to skip straight to where Gan Eden. The Gan Eden is Gimel Ushenis Bina. Right, the Elamis is Chitzenius Sabina. 1 second. Good. So the Elamis now you understand is the Murgish. Murgish Mitzad HaSeichel. Okay. So here he explains now, in that context, what's the difference between the Avodah when you're dealing still on an emotional and behavioral level is more connected to the Elamis. Gan Eden is more connected to emotions that have grown and developed. And then on top of page 1255, he says, all this is still the moichin that is shaykh to midas. And through the Aveda of a person, he says, the mother is still taking care of her offspring, the midas. Line number 6 is the key here. Line number 5. But what's nimshach de Aveda yichud pnimi da ava is the inner unification or union of Chachma and Bina, and there the Iker is Chachma, and also Bina Atzmi is Bina. Like he says, B'yasagas Hamahus, Pnimius HaKeser, and this is already the level of the Muskel Mamish. You've arrived at the level of the cognitive, and you really fully appreciate the inner personality of the divine. Midas that are Sichlim, that's Gadlus Abba. And through Torah Mitzvos that comes after this type of level of Ava. And v'zehu vayenecher began Eden la'avdo l'shamra shemamshichim ha'izeh teis v'ser began Eden gili b'chinas er chadash mamash. Remember, that's when you bring a completely new energy into Gan Eden that was not there on its own, even though on its own it's also a higher level. That gili the Gan Eden mitzanatzmei hakol b'chinas seder ishtalshus shenimshich ma'atzmei. Because the revelation in Gan Eden, even though it's a high level, it's still that's what's built into the structure. And even though that also has an element of some Aveda, like he said before on the bottom of page 1248. He back to that same line that he said back on bottom of 1221. It's more. It's not just double. It's more than what was there initially in Gan Eden. Why? Because it's a completely new Gili. Why? Because now we've risen above the behavioral, which is the structural, and even the structure of emotions, and even the structure of the cognitive. We've gone to a place where the emotions are changed, the very structure is changed through the Aveda. So Gan Eden now is a result of that. That Aveda causes Gan Eden to be very different in the sense that Aveda has changed its personality. And now he goes, and I'm going to again skip now, that this is the difference between Yizbu Atzei Hashem, that the trees of God, which is Gan Eden on its own, Yizbu, are sated and go beyond the regular, which is the whole next section here where he talks about what the trees represent. And then Yizbu, he goes back to Yizbu on page 1257, that this is the additional energy that's generated, that's higher than what Gan Eden has on its own. And that leads us to Nefesh Shvei Tovas when he speaks about that a sated soul tramples on and disregards honeycomb because it's deeper, because it's the Tainug Atzmi, more that's not felt. The deepest Tainug Atzmi, that's a taste of what will be La'asad Lave. That's the highest level we reach through our Aveda below. Okay. Now, on page 1261, the Rebbe Rashab goes, but Ach Tzarech Lavan HaKushish in his Bar Leil. we still have a question. Fine, you've told me that you've taught us that Gan Eden, that through Avodah we reach these higher levels. But that's an Elam Habriya. It's not according to say the Shtalshus. Gan Eden, at the end of the day, even with all this work, you've expanded Gan Eden, it's grown, it's a new energy. But how can Gan Eden, which is part of the structure of existence, contain this type of level of Tainug Atzmi that comes through Avodah? And that's where he answers, and because everything's connected. 1 second. Yeah, everything's still connected. At the end of the day, we're still dealing, like he said, I'm sorry, because Seder Shtalshus is based on a structure, a hierarchy, the Kalim of Atzilus. So how can that shine into Gan Eden, which is Bria? And his answer is Simcha Shal Mitzvah. Simcha elevates everything and breaks through these boundaries and breaks through the hierarchy and allows a lower level, the whole explanation, when Simcha literally changes someone from being, let's say, someone who's stingy, becomes expansive. It changes the personality of Seder Shtal, basically elevates the entire Seder Shtalshus. That's the answer. But then, as we've learned, after he finishes that, he says, at the bottom of 1266, fine. Now you've explained to me that you've expanded it through Simcha Shal Mitzvah, which is connected to Ava, B'chol Meidecha, Ava Rabba B'tainugim, and all of that he explained. But it's still, at the end of the day, the Kalim of existence. So he's still not satisfied. And that's where he comes and asks the question, at the end of the day, Yesh Lahavan Mehechen, I'm reading the bottom of page 1266. Where does Simcha have this power to reach Mamash and Atzmos? And this is where we come to the final answer, that is the Kalim that are rooted in Atzmos, the Rishimu that's higher than the Oyer. Till now, he has not brought that into the picture. So first he's expanded. First we started with the natural structure of existence. Gan Eden is a broader element of that. It's a higher level of consciousness. In Gan Eden itself, through Aveda, we lift it to a level of all the way to Keser, Chachma Bina, Bina Chachma Keser, and therefore you have that new energy that comes from those highest levels of refinement, where we're completely B'chol Meidecha and all that. But we still have to answer one thing. It's still the structure of existence. No matter how you twist it, all these levels have brought us and expanded our horizons and expanded that the Keli is receiving much more oyer than it was initially. It's not just a child. We've developed into a mature adult with a cognitive and emotional maturity, but it's still Kalim. And Kalim, at the end of the day, as he says on page 1267, are limited. That's what a Keli is. It has boundaries. It contains the energy. It's diminished, and so on. So now he comes and says, Achine be'emes, yesh yisn mel. I'm reading the first line of the paragraph on page 1267. So you see how the plot develops? That's a mile of Kalim over Eir. And that's the whole next bunch of pages explaining how Kalim are rooted deeper than Eir in the Kol Yochel, the Yochelis HaAtzmus, because Kalim reflect the Atzmus, the power to create something not like himself, so to speak. Eir is a reflection of God. But I'm not going to go over this whole thing because this we learned. This goes all the way to page 1270, where he says, that even though Eir is Gili and Keli is containment, yet the Keli itself, the very Keli, is rooted in Atzmos deeper than the Eir is. And then he adds on page 1271, Al Pizeh Yuvan, why Hamshach Simcha Shal Mitzvah Dafka? Because the Simcha, the Kalim, reach all the way to the Etzem. The Simcha and the Ava, B'chol Meidecha, and all the Giluyim make it revealed. And that's the answer. So you need both. You can't just say Kalim reach Etzem, because then it's not revealed and it's not integrated as we spoke. That's why you need all the Aveda. Gan Eden, you can't have Gan Eden with Maisa Mitzvahs alone. Even though Maisa touches the Etzem, but you're lacking a personalization, you're lacking internalization. Gan Eden is a result of the Kavana that comes with the Maisa. As he says, we need both. So the mitzvahs connect the kelim to the etzem, and the kavana and all the simcha and everything expands our personality that we can be kelim to it as well. So kelim to the oyer, I should say, not just that we connect to the etzem through a mitzvah, but the kelim to the oyer, that the oyer permeates and it's internalized in our being. And there you have both milas. And then comes the last paragraph that we learned. Pi kol hanal. I'm reading the last paragraph on page 1271. Yuvan bin amshachas teis v'ser beganed. The shezel dafke al de ma'isa mitzvahs. You need mitzvahs. Ubekavona sa mitzvahs uberusa deliba levad eimam shichin. You need ma'isas because that alone, kavona, is not going to do it. Because you need the rots and the mitzvahs are rooted in etzem, the kelim, and that's why it has to be ma'isa mitzvahs. Mashen kerusa deliba does not have that. It's only elevation. And then he says, but in order to draw down in a revealed way that's internalized, you need kavana. And that's the simcha shal mitzvah and the avodah of avad rabba b'tainugim. And then you have nimshach gili eir ha'atzmi. Ubilodei zeis eina nimshach b'chinas ha'atzmus. And without this, you're not going to have the hamshach of atzmus in a revealed way. You need the ma'isa, the kelim, but you also need the oir. And then the Rebbe Rashab says, I'm reading what we learned already. And with this will be resolved what was explained earlier on page 1212. There he said that the Maisa Mitzvah alone is not going to bring the Gilui of Gan Eden. It's dafka through the Kavana and the internal work that we do. But isn't it true that the real Hamshachas Atzmus was from the action? Remember the whole discussion, the action is higher than the Ruchnius in the mitzvahs. That was that question he asked all the way in the beginning. And that's Shazeh Yisr Matan Teda ala mitzvahs Shala Ovis. He's going back to what we learned. That's the advantage of Matan Teda over the Ovis. The Ovis there was only Beruchnius. So the answer is the Shnei Emes. Both are true. The Hamshachi al Dei Ma'isa Mitzvahs dafka. To generate, to trigger it all, you must have Ma'isa Mitzvahs. Without that, you don't have anything. And the spiritual work does not draw down Atzmus. In the parentheses, he just qualifies that even the Ovis also had some type of physical activity. On the other side, on the other hand, in order to stimulate and to draw his galus, the revelation of Eir Atzmus, there you need the kavana, the previous. Or the air remains concealed. The Eina Meir Begili and does not radiate in a revealed way. And that's why you don't have any additional energy in Gan Eden Elyon. Remember, Gan Eden Elyon is where the real energy that comes from the Aveda Primis, Kavana Primis. Kabbalah Seil, you have something of that in Gan Eden Atacht. So in order to have Gan Eden Elyon especially, you need both. You need the action, and you need to have and the Aveda of B'chinas Ava Rabba. That the person is completely consumed with this love in a revealed way. So now you see from here how he concludes that which we reviewed. So all this is literally a continuation of everything we read earlier on page 1211, 1212, and the further pages that I reviewed. So there you have the picture, and this is where we're up to actually. So I see I did now the summary from back there, brought it back to where we are, And now you can see somewhat the connection of how all this comes alive. Okay, perfect timing. So now I'll stop for any questions, because at this point, tomorrow we can continue learning further. He's going to go back to Schar Mitzvah. We still have to understand, what about the statements that there's no reward in this world? How do you understand that? How does that fit into this whole picture? So now we understand Gan Eden. We understand Gan Eden is created from the Kavanah, the power of Maisa Mitzvahs, the power of Kavanah, Simcha Shal Mitzvah, Avar Rabba, and how it all comes together. Giluyim and Etzem, which is the key. Etzem begilui. And the Etzem is through the action, the Kalim, and the Gilui is through the Eir, which is through the Kavanah and the love and all the Veda that we do in our growth and development. Now I'll stop here if anybody wants me to clarify anything further. I think this was a good overview, at least the best of my ability. Yeah. So go ahead. Anybody?
It was a beautiful synthesis.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. It still wouldn't hurt to review it again and again, because there's so many moving parts here. But this is the key. If you keep this structure, and you see, I especially went to the beginnings of paragraphs, because if you look at it, the Rebbe Rashab himself, essentially, even though he didn't make chapter numbers, but by beginning of paragraphs, you get a certain like headlines of each section as it develops. So we go back, you could see this whole picture emerging. Yeah.
So it's a very gross metaphor, very crass metaphor, but just to try to understand the beginning part about why the Eibishter sort of spent so much time building Gan Eden before he put Adam on, into the world. It sounds like Gan Eden, here's the crass metaphor, it's sort of like the inner plumbing of this spiritual, the whole structure, the metaphysics, the metaphysics of spirituality. The sort of Gan Eden is like part of the inner plumbing of it. Like you have the Seder Hishtalshelus, and it's
that's a fine metaphor. I understand. It's good.
Yeah. Okay.
Inner plumbing, you could say the inner electrical schematics.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's good. And then
go ahead.
And then Avodah increases all that you can go into that inner workings and really then expand it.
Right.
Yeah.
I use plumbing because of the water reference with the river flowing into Gan Eden, and
well, look at it this way. Gan Eden is the garden within Olam Hazah, within this world, the garden. Now we know the natural nature of a garden is it already is a superior state than the rest of the world around it. But the garden has the beautiful element. You see, the inner plumbing thing doesn't have in the mushal the example. How do you expand it? A garden is beautiful because a garden, God puts the garden there, and now it says, now you can make this garden more than what I originally put there. You can make it blossom and thrive in ways that are far beyond. In other words, the expansiveness of it that comes through Avodah is very clear with the meshal of the garden, with the example of the garden. In the example of the house, let's say, the inner plumbing, the problem is the house has certain limits. But just to imagine, if you can imagine, let's say you have the ability to expand your home. By going into its inner workings, you have the power to make it much larger and greater than it was originally. I just wanted to continue the metaphor because Avodah is vital here in the context of further development.
No, it's great. I have a 21st century metaphor, which is they write this AI software. They write software that writes software. Maybe that's a better analogy. I don't know.
No,
but by the way,
what I used to call, what do they call? They called it open source programming. So though you had the basic elements, but people could use them and develop it far further. Yeah.
By the way, it's not, people should hear, it's funny that my life, Chassidus applied this past weekend, you read the letter from some fellow who called you our galactic tour guide of Abia.
Yeah, that's right.
That was wonderful.
Yeah.
It was a high compliment, even though it was a funny way of saying it.
Yeah. Okay. I think this is, it's beautiful. It's a beautiful, the whole structures. Remember, Basi Lagani is coming up, Yud Shvat, and Lagani, come to my garden, Gan Eden. You see, the whole theme of the Mimer begins and is around that Gan Eden was where Adam was placed, and the Chet, unfortunately, did the opposite. It diminished the garden, and it caused the Shekhinah to conceal. And then Avram Avinu, and then the 7 generations bring it back. So it's a central metaphor that can explain so many different things. And it's not our metaphors from the Torah. The Torah, Gan Eden, is very prominent in the beginning of Bereshis when he talks about creation. So now it also makes sense. Because when you read Chumash Bereshis, you say, what's this garden anyway? Why did God make a garden? I mean, he couldn't put Adam and Chava in some city in Jerusalem or something, But you understand now how the garden is so critical in all its details of how you make it grow and how it's initially a beautiful garden and then becomes more beautiful. An example for the whole world, making the world into a garden that continues to blossom and thrive through our Aveda. We can make it grow and grow and expand it on all possible levels. You understand the Maisa Mitzvos and so on. Yeah, very good. Excellent.
So Lahabdil, the effect of Chet, of sin on Gan Eden is to sort of let it wither. Is that fair to say? It's not getting watered. It's not getting.
Yeah, that's you could say that.
Uh-huh. Okay.
Anybody else? Anybody else want to comment? Any questions? Or we're good? Okay, so we're back to 1271. We brought it back, and tomorrow we'll continue from 1272. Good.